What if I told you the US government mails Cuba a rent check every single year and Cuba hasn't opened it in 60 years? A lake on this island looks like spilled milk, and chemistry still can't fully explain why you can see the bottom. And buried in the Cuban jungle, there's an underground city carved into rock, built for Soviet nuclear submarines that appeared on 0 Western maps. You won't believe fact 27. Today, 40 facts about Cuba that sound fake but are 100% real. Fact 1. Cuba isn't one island. It's an archipelago of 4,195 islands, islets, and cays, most of them unnamed. Some flood completely in hurricanes and re-emerge after. Cartographers have to recheck the count. The Cuba on every classroom map is a simplified fiction. The real Cuba keeps changing shape. Fact 2. Cuba's coastline is 3,735 miles long. That's longer than the entire US East Coast from Maine to Florida, and it fits inside an island smaller than Pennsylvania. Every map of Cuba is lying about how much edge it actually has. Fact 3. There's a lake in Cuba that looks like spilled milk. Laguna de Leche, the milk lake in Ciego de Avila province, turns white from calcium carbonate particles suspended in the water. It is not a salt flat. It is not an optical illusion. The water is chemically persistently white. Most global atlases label it blue. It's easier than explaining it. Fact 4. Cuba sits on the grinding boundary of 2 tectonic plates. The North American plate and Caribbean plate meet directly beneath the island. Santiago de Cuba was leveled by earthquakes in 1766 and again in 1932. The fault beneath it is currently locked, pressure accumulating without release. Geologists don't use the word if. Fact 5. Cuba's westernmost point is geographically closer to Mexico than to its own capital. Cabo San Antonio, the western tip, sits nearer to Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula than to Havana, a country whose edge is closer to a foreign nation than to its own center. Every navy in the hemisphere has noticed. None of them has forgotten. Fact 6. The Gran Caverna de Santo Tomas is the largest cave system in Cuba and the Caribbean, 46 kilometers of mapped passages, discovered by geologists in 1951, despite local guides having known about it for decades and being disbelieved. It still isn't fully mapped. The deepest passages haven't been entered. What's at the end? Nobody currently alive knows. Fact 7. The smallest bird on Earth lives only in Cuba. The bee hummingbird, Melissuga helenae, weighs less than a penny and builds nests the diameter of a thimble. It is smaller than some of the insects that share its habitat. It exists nowhere else on Earth. If Cuba's forests disappear, the species disappears. Completely, mathematically. Still with us? Good, because we haven't touched the Soviet submarines yet. That's fact 16. Don't skip. Fact 8. Cuba has freshwater rivers flowing underneath the ocean floor. Underground aquifers extend past the island's coastline and push out beneath the sea. If you stood on the seabed off Cuba's northern coast, you'd be standing over moving fresh water. These aquifers feed Cuban agriculture. Salt intrusion from rising seas is already contaminating some of them. Fact 9. Cuba's Zapata Swamp, Ciénaga de Zapata, is the largest wetland in the Caribbean, larger than some Caribbean nations entirely. So isolated that species inside evolved separately from mainland relatives. Some still lack scientific names. It also happens to be the landing site of the CIA's most catastrophic military operation. The Bay of Pigs invasion force landed here, in a swamp. On a map they'd misread. Fact 10. There is a place on the western tip of Cuba called Maria la Gorda, Fat Mary. It's named after a French female pirate documented in colonial records who controlled the entire western coastline, effectively alone, for decades in the 1600s. Sailors traded passage for her permission. She held a geographic choke point. Her name is still on the map. No one put up a sign explaining why. Fact 11. Cuba's coral reef system is the second largest in the Western Hemisphere. And it's one of the healthiest reef systems on Earth, not because of environmental protection, because the US embargo prevented the industrial fishing fleets and resort development that destroyed every other reef in the region. The most pristine reef in the Americas exists because of a Cold War economic blockade. Fact 12. The Florida Current, the beginning of the Gulf Stream, flows through the 90-mile Straits of Florida between Cuba and the United States. The volume of water it moves per second exceeds the combined flow of every river on Earth. This current becomes the Gulf Stream, which stabilizes the climate of Western Europe. The average temperature in London is partly governed by what happens to the water surrounding Cuba. Fact 13. In fiscal year 2023, U.S. Border Patrol and Coast Guard recorded over 300,000 Cuban migrants intercepted in the Florida Straits, the highest number in recorded history. This 90-mile gap is the most dangerous managed maritime corridor in the Western Hemisphere. Historians estimate between 10,000 and 30,000 people have died crossing it since the 1960s. The U.S. Coast Guard officially categorizes recovered bodies as unidentified maritime migrants, filed under a code. Fact 14. During the Cold War, Cuba's Isle of Youth housed more than 20,000 foreign students from over 40 countries simultaneously. Angolan engineers, Mozambican doctors, Vietnamese administrators, Namibian military officers. The Soviet Union was building a generation of ideologically aligned global leaders inside a Cuban island, largely invisible to Western intelligence. Most of the host governments have since collapsed. The students became ministers, generals, and presidents. At its peak, the Isle of Youth had more African students per square mile than any country in Africa. It was geography used as ideology. Fact 15. Outside Cienfuegos, Cuba has an unfinished Soviet nuclear power plant. The Juragua nuclear power plant was 90% complete when the USSR dissolved in 1991. Workers left overnight, cranes were abandoned mid-lift, the reactor vessels were installed, the fuel had been ordered, it sits today, concrete shell, reactor frames, tropical vines, 250 miles from Miami. Fact 16. In 1970, US intelligence confirmed a Soviet submarine base was under active construction inside Cienfuegos Bay. The Soviets denied it. The Nixon administration issued a formal warning. Construction stopped, officially. The infrastructure carved into the bay's rock walls, the dry dock alcoves, the fuel pipelines, the hardened berths was never removed. It's still there, visible on satellite imagery, labeled as nothing. Fact 17. Cuba's exclusive economic zone extends 200 nautical miles in every direction, creating invisible ocean boundaries that overlap with US, Bahamian, and Mexican claims. No permanent treaty governs these overlapping zones. No binding arbitration exists. They have already generated diplomatic confrontations over fishing and oil rights. The only thing preventing something worse is the thing that was never signed. Fact 18. In October 1962, a Soviet submarine, B-59, was depth charged by US forces and lost communications contact. The crew believed nuclear war had started. Soviet protocol required agreement from 3 officers to launch a nuclear torpedo. 2 officers voted yes. The third, Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, voted no. Every person reading this exists because of that one vote. Fact 19. Spanish colonial maps labeled Cuba La Llave del Nuevo Mundo, the key to the New World. Every empire that attempted to control the Americas moved on Cuba first. Spain, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union. Britain captured it in 1762 and held it for 11 months. They traded it back to Spain in exchange for Florida. Both sides considered the trade fair. Fact 20. The United States pays Cuba $4,085 per year to lease Guantanamo Bay, a rate set by a treaty signed in 1903. Cuba has declared the lease illegal since 1959. The payments continued anyway. Since 1960, Cuba has refused to cash every single check. They still arrive every year from the US Treasury, addressed to the Cuban government. The United States currently owes Cuba over $260,000 in uncashed rent for land it uses as a military detention facility. Fact 21. The Guantanamo base creates a 17.4 square mile zone where Cuban law cannot enter and US constitutional law does not fully apply. The main gate connecting the American base to Cuban territory has been sealed since 1964. It exists. It has hinges. It has a lock. That lock has not moved in over 60 years. Fact 22. Between 1961 and 1999, Cuba maintained one of the largest minefields in the Western Hemisphere along the Guantanamo perimeter fence. The mines were cleared under international pressure. Officially, Cuban officials have confirmed on record that the clearance was not complete. Fact 23. In 1962, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on Operation Northwoods. The plan: stage fabricated Cuban terrorist attacks inside the United States, bombings in Miami, shootings in Washington, a sinking of a US ship, to manufacture public support for a full military invasion of Cuba. President Kennedy rejected it. The approved document was declassified and published by the National Security Archive in 1997. You can read it today. Fact 24. Since 1960, an estimated 1 million Cubans have attempted to cross the Florida Straits. The exact number who died is unknown. No government counts them. No memorial exists for them. The US Coast Guard files unidentified recovered bodies under internal case codes. The only record of many of these people is a number in a database they never knew was being kept. Fact 25. The Oriente Fault beneath eastern Cuba last fully ruptured in 1932, killing 2,500 people and destroying large sections of Santiago de Cuba. Seismologists describe it as seismically locked, stress accumulating without release. The longer a locked fault holds, the larger the eventual rupture. Santiago de Cuba is still built directly on this fault. It has to be. There is nowhere else the city can go. Fact 26. Cuba's offshore oil reserves are estimated at up to 20 billion barrels, some of the largest undeveloped reserves in the Western Hemisphere. They lie in deep water 60 miles from the Florida coastline. The drilling equipment required falls under US embargo restrictions, so Cuba drills using Russian and Chinese technology instead. A well blowout in these waters would reach Florida beaches in under 24 hours. There is no bilateral emergency response plan. Fact 27. During Cuba's economic crisis of the 1990s, certain beaches and resorts were accessible exclusively to foreign tourists, legally off-limits to Cuban citizens. Cubans living nearby could see these beaches from the road. They were prohibited from crossing onto the sand. The policy, described by critics as tourist apartheid, persisted for nearly a decade. It wasn't reversed because of external pressure. It ended when the Cuban government needed citizens' domestic spending. The math changed. The policy went with it. Fact 28. A city that floods from the inside out. Southern Cuban coastal settlements sit above networks of underwater sinkholes, blue holes, directly connected to the open ocean. In a major storm surge, seawater pushes backward through these underground conduits and erupts upward through the ground beneath streets. The flooding doesn't breach the coast, it comes up from below. No flood barrier in the world is engineered for water that attacks from underneath. Fact 29. Cuba is simultaneously sinking and being swallowed. A combination of land subsidence and accelerating sea level rise is consuming the northern coastline, in some zones at 3-5 meters per year. Climate modeling projects that portions of Havana's northern neighborhoods will be regularly inundated at normal high tide by the 2050s. Not during storms, not during surges, permanently, routinely, every day. Fact 30. In June 2014, Russian naval vessels, including a warship, a tanker, and a research ship, docked openly in Havana Harbor. No announcement preceded it. No press conference followed. It was the first time Russian military ships had entered Havana Harbor since October 1962. No Western outlet framed it as the return of a pattern. It was. Facts 31. That changes everything. Cuba trains and deploys more physicians per capita than the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Cuban doctors have been deployed to over 60 countries in disease outbreaks, earthquakes, and epidemics, including post-Hurricane Katrina New Orleans, where Cuba offered medical assistance that was quietly declined. Meanwhile, Cuban hospitals regularly operate without running water, basic antibiotics, or functioning surgical equipment. The map of medical production and the map of medical supply do not overlap. They are two completely separate maps. Fact 32. The Gulf Stream, which governs winter temperatures across Western Europe, originates in the waters directly surrounding Cuba. If Cuba's coastal ecosystem collapses from compounding erosion, pollution, and reef death, oceanographers believe the current's flow could weaken measurably. Average temperatures in the UK, France, and Scandinavia are partially determined by what happens off the coast of a 42,000 square mile island in the Caribbean. No European government publicly discusses this dependency. It exists regardless. Fact 33. Cuba's coral bleaching events have been documented since 1987. The 1998 El Niño thermal event bleached and killed significant sections of Cuban reef in a single season. In some zones, recovery has continued. In others, the coral has not recovered at all in 25 years. The areas of permanent biological silence on the reef floor are expanding. They don't have official names yet. Naming them would require acknowledging the trajectory. Fact 34. When Soviet subsidies collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost 80% of its fuel imports and 85% of its trade in under a year. To survive, Cuba built one of the world's most advanced urban organic farming systems, growing food in rooftops, vacant lots, hospital courtyards, and traffic medians, out of pure necessity. Scientists from more than 30 countries now study it as a blueprint for post-collapse urban food systems. The survival manual for feeding cities after infrastructure failure was written by Cuba. It was never intended to be a manual. Fact 35. Cuba contains more species of endemic birds per square kilometer than nearly any comparable landmass on Earth. Many of these species are concentrated in zones restricted by the Cuban military, accessible to no international biologist. They have not been fully cataloged. Some almost certainly have not been named. Some will probably disappear before they are. The Cuban solenodon, a venomous mammal whose lineage predates the dinosaur extinction, was declared gone in the early 20th century. It was rediscovered alive in Cuba in 1974. It is still here, barely. Fact 36. Cuba's northern K chain, the Jardines del Rey, contains islands that have measurably shifted position since the Spanish first charted them in the 1500s. Modern satellite imagery shows cays that have split, migrated, merged, and vanished entirely since aerial photography began in the 1960s. The Cuban Cartographic Authority revises its official cay count every decade. Every decade, the number is different from the decade before. Fact 37. The Windward Passage, the 80-kilometer strait separating Cuba from Haiti, is the single most critical maritime choke point in the entire Caribbean basin. Every commercial vessel crossing from the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico must pass through it. It has no permanent governing treaty, no neutral Coast Guard jurisdiction, no binding international authority. The entire Caribbean trade flow bottlenecks through a gap that neither Cuba nor Haiti formally controls. Fact 38. Under the Vienna Convention, a nation's embassies constitute sovereign territory on foreign soil. Cuba maintains over 120 embassies worldwide, including a fully operational embassy in Washington, D.C., 4 miles from the White House. This means Cuba has legally recognized sovereign territory inside the capital of the nation that has maintained an economic blockade against it for over 6 decades. Neither government raises this point in public. Neither needs to. Fact 39. Cuba's population is contracting at a rate not seen since the early colonial period. Since 2020, Cubans have been leaving the island at a pace exceeding any previous emigration wave in recorded Cuban history, including the Mariel boat lift of 1980. Cuba's birth rate has fallen below replacement level. The fastest growing Cuban city on Earth right now is not in Cuba. It's in Miami. Fact 40. Cuba is 90 miles from the most powerful country in economic history. It has outlasted 10 US presidencies under continuous economic siege. It survived a nuclear standoff that came within 1 vote of ending human civilization. It watched its eastern cities be destroyed by seismic faults twice and rebuilt them on the same ground. Its coastline is eroding, its coral is dying, its population is leaving, its aquifers are filling with salt. The only fact about Cuba that has not changed in 500 years is the 90-mile number. Everything else is in motion. Somewhere right now, an uncashed check for $4,085 is sitting on a desk in Havana, addressed from the United States Treasury. A family is 2 hours into a 90-mile crossing in the dark. A Soviet reactor vessel is sitting inside a concrete shell in the Caribbean heat, waiting for a decision nobody wants to make, and a city is being measured, meter by the ocean it was built beside. Geography is not something that happened, it's something that's happening. Cuba is not a place frozen in time, it's a place that is running out of it, and the water doesn't care what the map says.